Okay.
All right, here we go. So hi everyone, if you're just joining us, we have Michelle Prysby today who's going to be talking about gardening for wildlife. So we'll just give everyone a couple seconds to join us here, and then we'll begin with Michelle's presentation. All right, it looks like we've got a little bit of an audience. So let's go ahead and get started. We have a very special guest joining us this afternoon to introduce Michelle. We have Ed Jones, the Director of Virginia Cooperative Extension and Associate Dean of the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences at Virginia Tech. And his background is also in wildlife, so he's a perfect person to introduce Michelle. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Jones.
Thank you very much, Devin, and good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the program today as well. And Extension Master Gardeners and the Master Naturalists are a part of Virginia Cooperative Extension. And Virginia Cooperative Extension is a partnership of Virginia Tech and Virginia State University. And at Virginia Tech, it's a part of 3 colleges, in fact: the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, the College of Natural Resources and the Environment, and the Virginia Maryland College of Veterinary Medicine. And so today it is my pleasure to introduce Michelle, who is in the Department of Forestry and Environmental Resource Conservation in the College of Natural Resources and the Environment. And it's just a great pleasure to have people join us, as Extension's mission is to bring science-based information to the people of the Commonwealth. And so with that, I'm going to ask Michelle to bring her science-based information to the people of the Commonwealth.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that introduction, Dr. Jones. Welcome, everybody. I'm really excited to be talking with you today about gardening for wildlife. And partly because I could not bear to produce another PowerPoint presentation, and it's a beautiful day. I am talking to you not from my computer in my basement, but from my front yard in Albemarle County. So I hope you enjoy the background sounds of the birds chirping, etc., while I'm speaking today. So much of this beginning gardening series that Virginia Cooperative Extension Master Gardener program has organized has been focused on growing food. So why today are we talking about gardening for wildlife? One reason is because a lot of people really enjoy watching wildlife, whether it's your backyard birds or butterflies, or even the squirrels and chipmunks running around your yard. People really like watching wildlife. And wildlife can occur even in urban areas and in suburban areas like this one. So with just a little bit of effort, you can make whatever space you have, small or large, more friendly and attractive to wildlife, so that you can watch wildlife right from home. And during this time when many of us are spending a lot more time at home than normal, it is a great benefit to be able to watch wildlife from there. Another reason to talk about gardening for wildlife is that a lot of the principles associated with gardening to support wildlife overlap with the principles associated with natural resource conservation in general. So many of the steps that you take to make your gardens wildlife friendly will also help improve water quality in your local streams by reducing runoff and reducing contaminants such as fertilizers. It'll help reduce energy and water usage, help support ecosystem services like pollination, and more. And in Virginia, the vast majority of the land is privately owned. So conservation isn't just something that happens in our state parks or other public lands. It's something that requires everybody to do their part. So here's a roadmap for where we're headed in the next 30 minutes or so. I'm going to talk about 3 specific principles for gardening for wildlife that I think make a good starting point for beginners. Then I'll share a few more general considerations for you to keep in mind. And then I'll wrap up by talking a little bit about how gardening for food and gardening for wildlife can overlap. We'll have time for questions and answers at the end that Devin will facilitate. So let's begin with an analogy. When I'm talking about gardening for wildlife, I like to use the analogy of providing a great buffet. So take a moment. I want you to think about your favorite restaurant buffet that maybe you've been missing lately while restaurants have been closed. I personally have a friend who I frequently meet to go to a lunch buffet at an Indian restaurant. So that's the place I have in mind. I know I've been missing that. Okay, stick with me, and I'm going to show you why I'm talking about restaurant buffets and what in the world that has to do with gardening for wildlife. Okay, first, when you go to a restaurant buffet, you like to see food that you recognize and is what you expected. So when I'm at the Indian buffet, I want to see curries and chutneys and butter chicken. If I've chosen to go to the Indian buffet, I don't really want to see tacos or hamburgers that day. So the analogous wildlife gardening principle here is choose native plants. Native plants and wildlife are species that evolved in that region. So in North America, we often consider a plant species that has occurred here before European settlement to be a native species. Native plants are going to be adapted to local conditions. So in general, they're more likely to thrive. They are not maintenance free. That is a myth. But over time, they do often require less water, less input of fertilizers, less input of pesticides than many non-native plants. And really most important to the topic that we're discussing today, native plants better support native wildlife species. Native wildlife species and native plant species evolve together. And we've destroyed a lot of wildlife habitat through urbanization and development. But what we can do is use native plants to put some of that habitat back to help provide the food and shelter and other things that wildlife need to thrive. In his research, Doug Talame, a professor at the University of Delaware, looked at the relationship between native plant diversity and in landscapes and insect diversity. And he found that native woody ornamental plants on average supported caterpillars of 70 butterfly and moth species, but the non-native woody ornamental plants supported fewer than 10 butterfly and moth species on average. And this book, Bringing Nature Home, is a great non-technical book about his research findings and how they apply to our home landscaping, and I highly recommend that one. Now, maybe you're thinking, I don't really care about caterpillars. Why do I want caterpillars? Well, caterpillars are a primary food source for birds, especially birds that are feeding their young. So by having lots of caterpillars around, that's going to help you have more birds around. So presenting native Virginia wildlife with an array of plants that are from some other part of the world is kind of like having tacos at your Indian buffet. And instead, you want to have the native plants at your restaurant buffet in your landscape. And I'm going to talk a little bit later on about how to find out what's native in your area. Okay, let's go back to our analogy. Think back to your favorite restaurant buffet. Another thing that makes a buffet really great is the diversity. Having a lot of choices. I mean, that's why you do that instead of picking one thing off the menu. Different people with all kinds of different tastes can be happy. There's food for your kids and your grandkids as well as for adults. And the wildlife gardening principle here is have a diverse array of plants. And we can think about diversity in several different ways that I'll talk about. So first, a good goal for wildlife gardening is to support a whole natural ecosystem. Hang on, I've got a visual aid. Okay, the basis of any natural ecosystem are the plants. So that's the energy is coming in from the sun, and plants are turning that into food. And then plants are eaten by herbivores. Those are the animals that eat plants. And they might include insects that eat plants. They might include seed-eating birds. They might include critters like rabbits, and also nectar-feeding species like bees and butterflies. Herbivores get eaten by carnivores. So carnivores are animals that eat plants. And carnivores, maybe that brings to mind to you like a furry mammal with big teeth or something like that. But carnivores include toads and frogs, dragonflies, spiders, salamanders, and all kinds of other wildlife. And then you have secondary carnivores. Those are animals that eat animals that eat animals that eat plants. Secondary carnivores might include species like fox, snakes, hawks. In a suburban landscape like what I'm in, those are going to be your typical secondary carnivores. So when you're thinking about gardening for wildlife, the key here is that you really want to think about how plants are the basis for all of these other species. So by having a diverse array of plants, you're going to be able to support a more diverse array of herbivores, especially because the insects that eat plants are very frequently going to be specialists, meaning they only eat one or a few kinds of plants. So by having a greater diversity of plants, you'll be able to support a greater diversity of herbivores, and then maybe see more of these other levels of species. We can also think about diversity in terms of habitat structure. So I'm going to pan the camera around my street so you can see some of the other yards. Give me a second here. Okay, I'm going to take you on a walk just to check out my neighbor. Here, we'll kind of pan around. Okay, so what you'll see if you're looking at these yards is, I think, pretty typical. I'm not picking on any of my neighbors for sure. But what you're gonna see is these yards pretty much lack vertical structure. So they typically are going to have a layer of grass, turf or lawn, and then maybe a couple trees or shrubs. But if you go into a natural ecosystem like a forest, and we'll come back to my yard here. So in a more natural ecosystem like a forest, you're going to see that there are more layers. So you're going to see that there is, on the forest floor, covered in leaves, decaying wood, other decomposing material, basically natural mulch. And then moving up a little bit, you're going to see the herbaceous layer. So these are non-woody plants, flowering plants mostly. And even within that layer, there's diversity in structure because those herbaceous plants vary in height as well. So turf grass is an herbaceous layer for sure, but it's kind of lacking in diversity because it's all just one height and one type of plant. So if we're trying to create a more natural habitat, we're looking for an herbaceous layer with a lot more diversity in terms of types of plants and their sizes. Next on the natural system, you would see a layer of shrubs or small trees. And that's really the missing link in a lot of landscapes. Native shrubs have all kinds of wildlife value. They are places for birds to hide and nest. They are food for plant-eating insects. They're nectar for pollinators. And it's funny, I just discovered yesterday in, again, my neighbor's yard, I'll flip around. He only has a couple of shrubs in his yard. They're not native, but one of them that he does have for the second year in a row has a mockingbird nesting in it. So birds really are looking for places to go that aren't just grass. Okay, come back. There we go. And then the other layer that you're thinking about, want to think about is trees. And trees just provide so many ecosystem services. They help reduce energy usage by providing shade and protection from wind. They provide structure for animals to nest in and move about in. They're host plants for hundreds of pollinator and other insect species. And other animals might eat the fruit and nuts in trees. So for example, in my small front yard here, I have a dogwood tree, and there's something like 100 different species of insects that feed on the native flowering dogwood tree here in Virginia, plus many kinds of birds that come and eat the berries when they're ready in the fall. Okay, back to our buffet analogy. A top reason to go to a buffet is that it's all you can eat. It stays open, you can keep going back for more, right? So in your garden, you want to think about providing habitat for wildlife all throughout the seasons. If you're a bee, are you just eating in June? Are you just eating in August? Nope, you're eating from the spring through the fall. And that's true for butterflies and hummingbirds and species that don't hibernate or migrate away are foraging for their food in winter as well. So what you want to do is choose plants that bloom at different times so that your buffet always has food available for the pollinators. And you want to choose plants that have seeds or fruits that will be food for birds or other species even after the flowers fade. So that's some of the way you can provide food throughout the year. And another principle for keeping your buffet for wildlife open 24/7, 365 days a year, I'll just summarize as leave the leaves. So if your goal is to support wildlife, don't be quite as quick to clean up your garden in the fall. The pollinators and the other insects that have enjoyed feeding on the nectar, munching on the leaves in your garden need a place to spend the winter. And many of them do that in the leaf litter or in the woody plant debris that's standing at the end of the season, like this. So here's just some woody plant debris that was left in my garden. So ideally what you want to do is let the leaves remain in place and just naturally decompose if you can do that. And then if you need to remove that old plant growth, like what I have here, wait until May. So by the end of April, most of the insects that would have overwintered in that kind of material are likely to have emerged. So doing it at the end of April, beginning of May is a pretty good plan. If you need to remove it earlier in the spring for some reason, it's a good idea to set it off to the side of your garden rather than removing it from the site entirely. So maybe those insects can still emerge. I use that as the excuse for the giant pile of stuff I need to take to compost. Consider, along these same lines, consider leaving snags or standing dead trees if possible. So that's not always possible. It might be a danger to a structure or something like that. So in that case, take the tree down, but see if you can let the logs decompose naturally on your landscape, or at least let the stump decompose naturally, because you will attract a lot of great wildlife that way. I know a tree we had taken out in the front here, we left the stump, and it kept getting visited by pileated woodpeckers, which was lovely. It was great to be able to observe them. So just to recap, thinking about our buffet, you want your landscape to provide a year-round buffet that has a diversity of both species and structure. Now, on to just a few basic general considerations to keep in mind as you're getting started as a beginning gardener gardening for wildlife. First, and I bet that a lot of other presenters have mentioned this as well, you need to understand the conditions of your site. What's the soil like? How much sun does it get? Does it tend to be wet or dry or somewhere in between? Is there a slope? Is it exposed and windy, or is it sheltered? All those things are going to help you choose the plants that are going to be most successful in your site. And that's the better way to do it, rather than getting your heart set on a particular species of plant because you think it's beautiful or you think it's so cool, and then finding out that it's never going to grow where you are because you don't have the right conditions. The next principle, and I don't see this one written up very often, but it's something that I try to keep in mind, and that's work within your constraints. Everybody has constraints. Time and money are two of the most common. Those are two constraints that I have for sure. But you might also be constrained by the environmental characteristics of your particular site. You might be constrained by what plants are already on your property, maybe things that were planted by a previous owner. You might be constrained by what the other member of your household wants to have in your yard, or by what your HOA allows. or your ability to access places that sell native plants. So I just really encourage you to start your gardening for wildlife journey with some small steps that you know that you can sustain, rather than waiting to try to make the absolute perfect wildlife habitat. That's something you can work towards in the future, but don't try to make everything perfect from the get-go, or it'll be really hard to get started. Ideally, you want to choose plants that are native to your part of Virginia, as I already mentioned. So how do you find out what plants those are? There are great resources for that now. And I even might have chosen some plants in my yard differently had I known about those resources 20 years ago. And I choose my plants a little bit differently now. So here are some of them, and Devin's going to share links to these, I think, in the comments. So the first one is the Department of Conservation and Recreation's Natural Heritage Program's Native Plant Finder. So this is an online tool that where you can put in your region, coastal plain, Piedmont, mountains, what your site conditions are, full sun, very wet, etc. And then the kind of wildlife or conservation uses that you're hoping to provide, and it will give you a list of possible plants. So that's a great tool. If you prefer to flip through a publication to look for plants that kind of catch your eye, then look for one of the native plant guides for your region. And a place to find out about these is plantvirginianatives.org. And Devin will share that one with you too. The Virginia Regional Native Plant campaigns are part of this. They've been developed for 7 different areas of Virginia, not everywhere, but 7 different areas, and several more are in progress. And just as an example, here is the book for Virginia's capital region. And you'll see, if you flip through, it's organized by different types of plants, perennials, grasses, shrubs, etc. And it'll give you information on each of the plants in terms of its growing conditions and the kind of wildlife values that it provides. And it's really, these are a really useful tool, especially because the volunteers and specialists who've worked on these books have taken the time to try to put in plants that they know will be attractive to people. So of course there's tons of native plants out there that might not be compatible with having your yard look the way you want it to look, but these are chosen to also be beautiful and aesthetically pleasing. A more general book is this one from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that is called Native Plants for Wildlife Habitat and Conservation Landscaping. It's available online and is similar to those other native plant guides, but kind of works throughout the Chesapeake Bay region. The Flora of Virginia mobile app is absolutely the best resource for identifying plants in Virginia. And I have that here as well, because I just want to show you that you can use this app to find plants that are going to be native to your region and also meet the growing conditions that you have. And they actually have instructions on how to do that using the app in the reference library here. So if you go to the reference library, use the app to pick natives for your yard. So if you don't have the Flora of Virginia app, I do recommend that one. And also the digital atlas of the Virginia flora is an easy place to look up which species are native to your particular county. The species data in the digital atlas will match what's in the Flora of Virginia app. And basically, if you're, I mean, I've done this myself. If you're wandering around the local native or the local plant nursery and you're wondering whether the plants they have labeled as native actually are native in your particular area, you can pull up the Flora of Virginia app or the digital atlas and see if that claim is really true. And both of those resources are also going to list introduced or non-native plants that have become naturalized in Virginia. So you'll just have to look at the key and see, does it say that it's a native? But there's no consumer protection around the label of native at a nursery or a place that sells plants. So you can't necessarily believe the label. It's good to check on that. Another general thing to think about, if you're gardening for wildlife, you probably need to accept the fact that some of your plants will be eaten. So if you are planting tomatoes or broccoli or other food plants, then seeing signs of insects or other wildlife eating your plants isn't really what you want. That's why people are calling their local extension office to ask for help with those things. But if you're gardening for wildlife, part of your goal is to be feeding the animals of the ecosystem with your plantings. So if you walk outside and see that your milkweed plant has been munched, that's great. It might mean that you've provided habitat for a monarch butterfly caterpillar or a milkweed beetle or some other creature that is native in our area. That said, keep in mind that if you build it, they will come. So your wildlife habitat, it might attract deer, groundhogs, rabbits, and other creatures that either might not always stick to the plants that you wanted them to eat or stay in the places that you wanted them to be. So take some basic steps to minimize chances of negative human-wildlife conflict. For example, don't leave pet food outdoors as a starter. Keep your garbage cans securely closed. And keep areas under houses and porches sealed up if you can, and under sheds and that kind of thing to prevent animals that you wouldn't want to live there from getting in there, like a skunk, for example. And Virginia Cooperative Extension has additional publications relating to wildlife-human conflicts if you need more information on that. So some wrap-up points. Sometimes gardening for food and gardening for wildlife can be very compatible. So for example, these trees in my front yard here are pawpaws, and that's a species that's native to Virginia. It has a red flower. I'll hold it close to the camera here. That has a slightly rotting smell. It's pollinated by flies and beetles. But this tree produces a large tropical tasting fruit. That's the largest native fruit in North America. It kind of tastes like a cross between a banana and a mango. And this tree, in addition, is a host plant for the native butterfly species, the zebra swallowtail butterfly. And so I always hope to see the leaves of my pawpaws munched by zebra swallowtail caterpillars because it means I'm providing habitat for them. The fruit is attractive to many animals, including raccoons. I don't tend to share a lot of the fruit with the wildlife, but I do leave some on the ground for foraging animals to enjoy. Likewise, the native passion flower vine, also called maypops, has absolutely stunning flowers. It's a host plant for several species of butterflies, and it produces edible fruit. The American hazelnut is a native shrub that produces edible nuts that can be eaten by both birds and humans, and its leaves are eaten by many insect species. My last thing here is to say, I encourage you to keep notes on your observations of the plants that you try and the wildlife species that visit them, because that'll help you learn what's going to be most successful in your yard as you continue past your beginner stage and on to your intermediate stage. After this gardening for wildlife beginner session, you might be ready for some more in-depth information. So a couple of other really great references are Habitat Gardening for Wildlife by Carol Heiser with the Department of Game and Inland Fisheries, and Devin will share that link with you. It's also part of the Virginia Cooperative Extension Master Gardener curriculum. And then another publication from Extension called Backyard Wildlife Habitats. So those are great follow-ups for you. Thanks so much, and I'm happy to try to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Michelle. That was perfect. I learned a whole lot, and hopefully lots of people did too. So we have a couple questions. One is, can you make a sort of basic recommendation for if you're just trying to get started with native plants and you go to like Lowe's or just a regular nursery? What would be a good starting point if you just want to get a couple natives to add?
Wow, I think before I went to Lowe's, I would try to, or somewhere like that, I would try to look at one of those native plant guides online, like the one for the Richmond area that I showed you. Maybe even if you don't have one for your area, but there's one that's kind of close to your area, it might be close enough. I think that that might draw your attention to some species that might be more likely to be available. At a place like that. The other thing that I would recommend is the Virginia Native Plant Society keeps a list of plant nurseries that, hang on, I'll let the mail truck go by. They keep a list of native plant nurseries that are known to propagate native plants in a sustainable way. They're not going and digging them up from the wild. And those would be good places to check. You might be more successful if one of those is in your area than if you try at just your basic home gardening store. But that said, that plantvirginianatives.org is part of this campaign across Virginia to try to work on more marketing of native plants. And so part of what that group and organization is doing is trying to work with all kinds of nurseries to encourage them to have more native plants, to educate people so that customers are showing that they're interested in buying native plants so that there'll be a market for it.
That's great advice. If anyone else has questions, you can type them in the comments and I'll get them. Another question, and this is kind of a big one, is do you have any recommendations for dealing with HOAs or neighbors if you're trying to change up the way your front yard looks?
Yes. I guess I'll start with neighbors and say that I think our neighbors definitely gave us some strange looks when we came out and tore out all of the front yard because this was all grass. But I think over time, they got used to it and we're very careful along the property line to, if our trees are dropping leaves across the property line or something like that, then I take care of raking them up so that we're not causing impacts onto their landscape the way that they want it to be. But actually what happens mostly is that people walk by our yard and say, oh, I love seeing all the things that are coming up. It's so nice to see the flowers. So that hasn't been too much of an issue for us, especially if you do it in a way that demonstrates that it's planned. So versus just stopping mowing your lawn, which is probably, there are some good things about that, but it's probably not going to have the result you want because your lawn is probably full of lots of non-native weedy species. And if you just stopped mowing, you're probably not going to end up with a beautiful meadow ecosystem full of native plants. And so I recommend doing things in a more planned way and taking small steps. Now, HOAs, they seem to just differ so much in terms of what their rules are and what they allow. And I think it might just be a slow progression of working on educating the people who are the decision makers within your HOA, maybe sharing this great information from all of our state agencies and other resources that we've shared today with them so that they know it's not just some wingnut environmentalist thing to want to plant these sort of things in your yard, but it is a concerted effort that is supported by our state agencies across Virginia.
That's good advice too. So a couple people want to know, what is the shrub behind you, not the pawpaw, the other one over your shoulder?
Is it the one with the white flowers?
Mm-hmm.
That's a fringe tree.
Okay.
If that's
and then,
the one they're talking about.
Yeah, I think that's it. And then another question about growing pawpaws. So can you just plant one pawpaw or do you have to plant two so there's a partner to pollinate? And then do you have any recommendations or just general tips for growing your own pawpaws?
We are definitely somewhat outside of my area of expertise because I am not a pawpaw growing specialist. I will say the University of Kentucky Extension has a whole pawpaw growing area of specialty, and they've got a lot of publications on that. So I definitely refer people to that. But I can tell you about my own experience, which has been that they are pretty easy to grow. I do not have the pawpaws planted in the type of habitat that they would grow in naturally. So naturally, pawpaws are an understory tree, maybe in kind of wetter places, definitely in the shade because they're under the bigger trees. But they grow fine as a specimen tree out in the full sun and produce more fruit that way. So if that's your goal, fruit production, it is fine to have them planted in the full sun. It's not ideal to have them in a super windy area. And I am on top of a hill in a super windy area. So that was maybe not the best choice for me, but they seem to be doing okay. They do send up a lot of suckers. So you have to kind of make a decision on which ones of those you're going to cut off and which ones you're going to let grow up. And it becomes a pawpaw patch, and it's going to kind of evolve over time. And yes, you do want to have more than one. Pawpaws are notoriously low in terms of pollination and fruit set. And so definitely having cross-pollination with another individual is helpful.
One last question here. So for people, maybe if you're growing a vegetable garden, or maybe if you're just concerned because you've heard about native bees, what are some recommendations you have for people who want to attract and help native bees in their gardens?
Oh, that is such a great goal. And that's a wonderful thing to want to do, and fantastic. Our native bees are really important for pollinating all our native plants and for all the other ecosystem services they provide and ways they fit into the natural community. And I think that you can start with any of those guides that we talked about before that will help you identify which of the plants are going to be attractive to bees. So that's a good starting point. Another thing to think about, again, is choosing plants that are going to be blooming at different times. So right now I've been seeing, today I saw bumblebees visiting the blue star that we have here. I saw them visiting the wild indigo, that's the purple plants that we have behind me, and visiting the sweet shrub that we have. And so, but those things are going to be done blooming soon. And I want to make sure that I have other plants for the bees to feed on when those are done. Another thing for native bees that I didn't talk about, but that's something to keep in mind, is a lot of our native bees nest in the ground, in bare ground. So keeping some patches of bare ground in your garden that the bees can access will help provide habitat for them. And then there are also bees like mason bees that will nest in cavities. And you sometimes see those mason bee hotels for sale. And I would just say, if you are going to construct something like that or purchase something like that, there is a recent article, I didn't send this link to Devin ahead of time, but there is a recent article that was in the Virginia Tech News from one of our specialists talking about what makes a good mason bee hotel and what you should do to keep it clean and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, I wrote that actually. We talked to Tim before.
Oh, good.
And he does have a number of good recommendations and different things you should look for. And also, if you're going to buy one of those commercially, what to look for in one that you're purchasing to make sure it's actually going to be a good place for bees to live.
Yeah. Yeah, I will say I'm hesitant to recommend any specific plants for pollinators because people might be calling in from all different areas of the state and maybe things, aren't right for your area or growing conditions. But mountain mint is a plant that is native across at least a big chunk of Virginia. And it is a great pollinator attractor. And a lot of people find that that's a good starting plant in their garden. And it's easy to grow, like many mints.
Well, thank you so much, Michelle. If you asked a question and we didn't get to it, Normally for these, I'll go back through as the Master Gardener account and direct you to resources. If you have any questions, you can always go to your local extension office or find your local Master Naturalists or Master Gardeners, and they'll be able to give you really specific recommendations for your area and answer questions you have. Next week, we're going to have Joel Kochi of VSU, and he's going to do a little introduction to woody plants and talk a little bit about how you can make sure your trees are going to be safe during thunderstorms this summer. Just make sure all of your shrubs and trees are in good shape going into the summer. So thank you so much, Michelle. That was a great presentation. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you. It was fun.